The old house. At the end of a dark, quiet street stood an old house, one that had long been the subject of whispered rumours and unsettling tales. The shutters were perpetually closed, the paint peeling, and the garden overgrown with weeds that seemed to creep and stretch like skeletal fingers. People rarely passed by it, and even fewer dared to walk up to the door. The house never participated in Halloween festivities, and every year children would steer clear of it, huddling together as they whispered about the strange, unseen owner who lived within. But this Halloween, something was different. As the sun set, and the streets filled with the sounds of laughter and costumed children running from house to house, a few passers-by noticed something unusual. There were Halloween decorations at the old house, carved pumpkins with flickering candles, cobwebs strung across the porch, and, most curiously, a large cauldron placed at the end of the pathway. The cauldron was filled with candy, and a small, weathered sign was propped up next to it, illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp. "Just take one, as greed is a sin." Most of the trick-or-treaters gave the house a wide berth, their imaginations filled with the tales they'd heard. But one man, a tall figure in a black coat, stood at the edge of the street, his young child tugging at his hand. The man's name was David, and he had been forced to take his son, Alex, trick-or-treating until the boy's bag was overflowing with sweets. David wasn't exactly thrilled. He was tired, his feet ached, and he had hoped to be home by now. But there was still room in Alex's bag, and David was determined to fill it. As they passed by the old house, Alex hesitated, his eyes wide as he looked at the cauldron. "Dad, can we skip this one?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. David glanced at the sign, then at the cauldron overflowing with candy. "Oh, don't be silly," he said, gripping his son's hand a little tighter. "Look at all that candy just sitting there. We'll be done in no time." "But the sign says—" "The sign is just to scare kids, Alex," David interrupted, guiding his son towards the cauldron. "It's Halloween. We're supposed to get as much candy as we can, right?" Alex didn't argue, though he cast a nervous glance at the house as they approached. David knelt down by the cauldron, scooping handfuls of candy and dropping them into Alex's bag, ignoring the sign's warning. One handful, then another, and another, until the bag was bulging. "There we go," David said with a satisfied smile. "That should do it." As he stood up, ready to leave, a chill ran down his spine. He looked around, confused, and noticed that the air had grown unnaturally cold. Slowly, a thick fog began to roll in from the edges of the street, creeping along the ground and rising up to surround them. It was as if the night itself was closing in, smothering the streetlights and muffling the sounds of laughter from the children nearby. David's smile faded, his heart beating a little faster as the fog thickened, swallowing the path ahead. He glanced back at the old house, its dark windows staring back at him like hollow eyes, and he felt a creeping sense of dread, as if something was watching him from the shadows. "Dad," Alex whispered, tugging at his coat. "Can we go now?" David nodded, trying to sound calm. "Yeah, let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the fog grew denser, swirling around them and blocking their path. David's grip on Alex tightened, and for a moment he thought he could hear something faint, a whisper, low and soft, barely audible over the rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of Halloween night. It was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a voice that echoed in the fog, carrying a message that sent chills down David's spine. And those who take more than their share must pay the price. The fog grew thicker, swallowing them whole, and the path ahead disappeared into the darkness. David's story, the dragon tattoo, the thick fog that surrounded David and his son, swallowed them whole, and suddenly the old house and cauldron of candy were gone. David found himself standing in a different place, the memory of the house slipping away like a forgotten dream. He was outside a small tattoo shop, its window displaying a variety of intricate designs. One, in particular, caught his eye, a dragon, its scales glistening with ink, curling around flames. David had always admired tattoos, but never had the courage to get one. As he was about to walk away, the shop's door opened, and the owner, a man with piercing eyes and a sly smile, looked out and pointed to the dragon design. Without a word, he nodded encouragingly, as if he knew David's unspoken thoughts. "Oh, go on then," David muttered to himself, feeling a strange urge to indulge. He stepped inside. Later, on his way home, David couldn't help but admire the dragon tattoo now inked onto his arm, the intricate design coiled around his bicep, scales shimmering with detail. He was thrilled. It was bold, powerful, and something he'd secretly wanted for years but had been too scared to get done. When he showed his friends, they all praised the tattoo, admiring its artistry. But within a few days, the tattoo began to itch, and not just the usual post-ink irritation. It was a deep, burning itch that drove David to scratch constantly. When he finally checked his arm in the mirror, he was shocked. The tattoo seemed larger. It had extended down his arm, almost doubling in size, the scales appearing more vivid, as if alive. Alarmed, David returned to the tattoo shop, but when he arrived, the windows were dark and the door was locked. Confused, he banged on the glass, but there was no answer. A passerby, an elderly man, stopped and gave David a strange look. "That place has been closed for years," he said, shaking his head before walking away. David was baffled. He scratched his head, sure he had the right address. How could it be closed when he had just been there? Days passed, and the tattoo continued to spread. It crept down his arm, wrapping around his wrist and up toward his shoulder, the scales glinting in the light. Desperate, David went to see his doctor, showing him the expanding ink. "Come now, David," the doctor said with a chuckle. "A tattoo can't grow. I'll give you some antibiotic cream. You're just having a reaction." But the cream did nothing. Within a week, David's arm was entirely covered, the tattoo now resembling the scales of a dragon. The skin felt tough, almost reptilian, and he found himself hiding it under long sleeves, too embarrassed to show anyone. In his desperation, David heard of an old tattoo master from Japan who was visiting the city. The man was said to have unparalleled knowledge of the art, even when it came to removing tattoos. David waited all day to see him, and when he finally showed the master his arm, the old man's eyes widened with recognition and fear. "You have been cursed with the dragon," the master said in a low, grave tone. "The dragon hoards gold, a greedy creature of nightmares. Tell me, David, are you a greedy person?" "No, I'm not," David stammered, but before he could say more, the master was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the room. A month passed, and no one had seen David. His colleagues grew worried, and one of them decided to check on him. After knocking on the door for 20 minutes, the door finally creaked open, revealing David, draped in a long robe, his face hidden behind a surgical mask. "What's the matter, David?" his colleague asked. Stepping forward, "Are you sick? Let me call a doctor." "No," David replied, his voice sounding strange, deeper, almost growling. "A doctor can't fix this." Slowly, he removed his mask and robe. What stood before the man was not the David he once knew, but a grotesque figure covered from head to toe in scales of ink. The dragon tattoo had spread across his entire body, transforming him into a creature of legend. His skin was a dark, scaly green, his eyes slitted like a serpent's, and his face had elongated into a dragon's snout, with sharp, glistening teeth. "Can a doctor fix this?" David asked, his voice echoing with a low, reptilian hiss. The colleague stumbled back, horrified, his mind unable to grasp the sight before him. But before he could scream, David slammed the door shut, and the house was silent once more. Back to the old house. The scene fades, and we return to the foggy street outside the old house. From the thick, swirling mist, a small figure emerges, David's child, clutching a bag full of candy, eyes wide with confusion. But there is no sign of David. The child looks around, searching for his father, but the fog closes in, and the old house looms dark and silent behind them. No one ever saw David again. Joe's story, The Hungry Vampire. The street was filled with the sounds of Halloween night, laughter, footsteps, and the rustling of candy bags. Among the trick-or-treaters, 3 young women in their early 20s strolled down the sidewalk, enjoying the night's festivities. They weren't dressed up, but their spirits were high, and they shared jokes and stories as they passed house after house. One of them, Joe, glanced at the candy-filled bags of the children walking by and grinned. "Why should all the little kids get the treats?" she said with a playful smirk. "We deserve some fun too." Her friends, Amber and Lucy, rolled their eyes but couldn't help but laugh. As they walked, they came upon the old house, the one most people avoided, the one that never participated in Halloween. But tonight, something was different. The house was decorated, and at the end of the pathway sat a large cauldron, overflowing with candy, a sign propped up beside it that read, "Just take one." Amber shivered and tugged on Joe's sleeve. "I'm not going in there. That place is creepy." "Me neither," Lucy agreed. "I don't care how much candy there is." Joe just laughed. "Oh, come on. Look at the size of that candy hoard. You two are such scaredy cats." Without waiting for them, Joe marched up the path toward the cauldron, ignoring the sign completely. She began scooping handfuls of candy into a bag, her friends watching nervously from the sidewalk. "Joe, the sign says." "Forget the sign," Joe said with a dismissive wave, continuing to fill her bag until it was heavy. "They're practically begging people to take it." But as Joe turned to leave, a thick fog rolled over the pathway, enveloping her. The old house, the cauldron, and her friends faded into the mist, and everything went dark. Joe blinked and found herself somewhere else entirely. She was sitting in a dimly lit living room, a bowl of popcorn in her lap, with 2 other friends next to her. The television played an old vampire movie, the kind with campy costumes and exaggerated acting from the 70s. Joe recognized her friends. They were Amber and Lucy, but dressed differently, as if they belonged in a different time. They laughed at the movie's campy scenes, the exaggerated capes and fake blood. "Whatever happened to Shelley?" Amber asked, still chuckling. "She used to love this stuff." "I don't know," Lucy replied, shrugging. "Went off with some rich guy from Eastern Europe, I think. Lucky her." "Wish some rich guy would come for me," Joe said with a playful sigh, stretching her legs. They all laughed, but somewhere, miles away in a dark, secluded mansion, something stirred. In a cold, damp basement, deep within the countryside, there was the faint sound of scratching, sharp nails scraping against an old wooden door. Behind the door, a soft, pitiful voice spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "Please, I'm so hungry. I've been here for months without a feed." The doors creaked open, and a tall, elegant figure stepped inside. He was pale, with sharp features and dark, menacing eyes. The vampire's expression was cold as he looked down at the gaunt figure crouched on the floor. A girl, her skin tight against her bones, her eyes glowing red, her once beautiful face now almost skeletal. "It is your time to feed," the vampire said, his voice smooth and commanding. "You have waited long enough. Now go and find what you crave." The girl's name was Shelley, and she didn't need to be told twice. Her eyes flashed with hunger, and she rushed out of the basement, disappearing into the night. Back in the living room, Jo glanced at the clock. "Well, I'd better be off. Got work in the morning," she said, standing up. "Maybe on the way home I'll get swept off my feet by a secret admirer," she added with a wink. As she walked through the dark streets heading home, Jo heard a faint noise, like the rustle of leaves, or perhaps someone's soft footsteps. Then she heard her name being called, barely above a whisper. "Jo." She turned, squinting in the dim light, and saw a figure standing at the end of the street. The figure was gaunt, almost skeletal, shivering in the cold, but there was something familiar about her. Jo's eyes widened. "Shelley, is that you?" "Yes," the figure replied, her voice weak and trembling. "Help me, Jo, please." Jo ran over, her concern overriding her fear. "Oh, Shelley, you poor thing. What happened to you?" She helped Shelley into her car, driving them to her flat. "Don't worry, we'll get you sorted out." In Jo's flat, Shelley sat on the couch, her eyes hollow and dark, but a small, sad smile played on her lips. "So, what about this rich guy you met?" Jo asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Think he'd have a friend for me?" Shelley's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Just like you, Jo. Always thinking of yourself over others." Before Jo could react, Shelley lunged, her thin, sharp fingers latching onto Jo's shoulders. Her mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, pointed teeth, and she bit down on Jo's neck, drinking hungrily. Jo's screams were muffled as Shelley drained every last drop, her own body filling out, becoming more alive, more vibrant, with each passing second. Back to the old house. The scene shifts back to the foggy path outside the old house. The fog begins to lift, and Jo's two friends stand there, looking around anxiously. They wait for her to emerge. But as the fog clears, there is no sign of Jo. Only the empty pathway, the cauldron, and the old house, dark and silent as it always was. No one ever saw Jo again. Lisa's story, the greedy gardener. The chill of Halloween night was softened by the warm glow of porch lights, as children dressed in costumes ran from house to house, their laughter echoing down the street. Among them was Lisa, a woman in her mid-30s, guiding her daughter from door to door. Lisa had always been a lover of beautiful things, especially flowers. Her garden was filled with rare and exotic plants, some of which she had not so honestly acquired over the years. If she saw something she wanted, she took it, and no fence or sign could stop her. As they made their way down the street, Lisa noticed the old house, the one people usually avoided. She felt a thrill of curiosity when she saw it was decorated for Halloween. More intriguing still was the large cauldron filled with candy at the end of the path, a sign beside it that read, "Just take one, as greed is a sin." Lisa's daughter tugged on her sleeve. "Can we skip this one, Mum? It looks creepy." Lisa's eyes gleamed. "Don't be silly. Look at all that candy. They're practically giving it away." She walked confidently up to the cauldron, ignoring the sign. As she scooped handfuls of candy into her daughter's bag, she smirked. "People put up signs like this just to scare you. They don't mean anything." She continued to take more, until the bag was bulging with sweets. But as they turned to leave, a cold fog began to roll in, thicker than any Lisa had ever seen. It crept along the ground, curling around her feet, and enveloping her entirely. She felt a strange sensation, as if the world around her was shifting, and then everything went dark. When the fog lifted, Lisa found herself standing in a garden, unlike any she had ever seen. It was lush, vibrant, and filled with the most beautiful exotic flowers, blooms in colours she had never even imagined, their petals shimmering in the light. The air was thick with the sweet scent of blossoms, intoxicating and almost overwhelming. Lisa's eyes widened with delight. She reached out to touch a large crimson flower, its petals velvety, soft against her fingers. "Oh, these are beautiful," she murmured, enchanted. "I have to have them." She began collecting the flowers, eagerly plucking them from their stems, filling her arms with as many as she could carry. She was too engrossed in her collection to notice that the garden was silent, unnaturally so. There were no sounds of insects or birds, just the rustle of leaves as she moved through the overgrown paths. As Lisa continued deeper into the garden, the plants around her seemed to grow denser, their leaves thick and waxy, their tendrils stretching out as if to greet her. She knelt down to admire a rare blue orchid, but when she tried to pick it, the stem wouldn't budge. She tugged harder, but it was as if the flower was rooted in stone. Suddenly, she felt something brush against her ankle. She glanced down and saw a vine curling around her leg, slowly tightening. What the? She tried to pull it off, but more vines slithered out from the foliage, wrapping around her wrists and ankles, binding her to the ground. Panic surged through her as she struggled to free herself, but the more she fought, the tighter the vines became. She watched in horror as the flowers she had been so eager to collect began to move, their petals opening wider, revealing sharp, thorn-like teeth. The plants swayed, almost as if they were watching her, waiting. "Let me go!" Lisa screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the dense, humid air. The vines began to pull her down, dragging her into the soft, damp earth. She could feel the soil give way beneath her, sucking her in like quicksand. Her arms and legs were trapped, the tendrils coiling tighter, squeezing the air from her lungs. As the vines pulled her deeper, Lisa's vision blurred, and she saw the flowers bending down toward her, their petals closing in like hungry mouths. She could barely breathe, the sweet, sickly scent of the garden filling her nostrils. Her last thought, as she was pulled under, was a twisted realization. She had been too greedy, always taking what she wanted, and now the garden was taking her. The following morning, the garden was still. The fog had lifted, and the sun shone brightly on the overgrown yard. The plants swayed gently in the breeze, their petals glistening with dew. The garden looked even more beautiful than before, the colours more vibrant, the flowers fuller, and there, in the centre of the garden, a new flower had bloomed, a large, exotic bloom, with petals that were a soft, rosy pink, delicate and flawless. If anyone had been close enough to look, they might have noticed something strange about the flower. Its petals seemed to form a shape, a face, serene and peaceful, bearing an eerie resemblance to Lisa. But no one was there to see it, and Lisa was never seen again. Erica's story, the eternal dance. The streets were alive with the buzz of Halloween night. People of all ages, dressed in their finest costumes, roamed the neighbourhood, and the air was filled with laughter and the occasional shriek of excitement. Among the crowd was Erica, walking arm in arm with her friends. She was dressed in a simple, elegant outfit, but her eyes darted around, envious of the more elaborate costumes she saw. She had always been that way, constantly comparing herself to others, wishing she had what they had. As they made their way down the street, Erica and her friends passed the old house. Erica paused, intrigued. The house was dark and imposing, but tonight, for the first time she could remember, it was decorated for Halloween. A large cauldron sat at the end of the path, overflowing with candy. The sign beside it read, "Just take one as greed is the sin." Her friend shuddered, ready to move on. "Let's skip it," one of them said, glancing nervously at the old house. "That place gives me the creeps." But Erica had already made up her mind. She walked up to the cauldron, her eyes gleaming as she reached for the candy. "Oh, come on," she said, scooping several pieces into her bag. "Who's going to know?" Besides, look at all this. It's just sitting here." She laughed as she filled her bag, ignoring the sign. But as she turned to rejoin her friends, a thick fog rolled in, swirling around her feet and rising up to swallow her whole. Her friends called out to her, but their voices were muffled, distant, and soon the world around Erica faded to black. When the fog lifted, Erica found herself in a completely different place. She was no longer outside the old house. She was standing in the centre of a grand ballroom. The room was magnificent, filled with sparkling chandeliers and gilded mirrors that reflected the light of 1,000 candles. Exquisite decorations adorned the walls, and the floor was polished to a perfect shine. It was like stepping into a scene from a fairy tale. Erica was surrounded by people dressed in elegant costumes, their faces hidden behind ornate masks. The music was soft, melodic, and she felt a strange sense of euphoria wash over her as she looked around. A man, tall and handsome, approached her. He was dressed in a dark, elegant suit, and his mask was made of gold, intricately designed to resemble a raven. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice smooth and inviting. Erica hesitated for a moment, but the allure of the ballroom, the music, and the man's charming smile was too much to resist. "Yes," she replied, slipping her hand into his. As they danced, Erica felt more alive than she had ever felt. The music was intoxicating, the rhythm perfect, and she moved with a grace she didn't know she possessed. Her partner was light on his feet, guiding her effortlessly across the floor. For once, she wasn't thinking about what she lacked, what others had that she didn't. She was lost in the dance, in the elegance and beauty of the moment. But as the night wore on, something began to change. The music grew louder, more frantic, and she noticed that the faces of the other dancers, once so lively, were becoming gaunt, hollow. Their masks had slipped, revealing sunken eyes and skeletal features. Their movements became stiff, mechanical, as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. Erica's heart raced, and she glanced up at her partner, expecting to see the same charming smile, but his eyes were dark, and there was something predatory about the way he looked at her. She tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip, his smile widening, revealing sharp, pointed teeth beneath the mask. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice now cold and mocking. "The night is still young, and we haven't finished our dance." Panic surged through Erica. She looked around for an exit, but there were none. The mirrors showed her reflection, twirling gracefully, but it wasn't her. It was someone else, a gaunt, pale figure wearing her dress, moving in perfect sync with her, as if mocking her struggle. "Let me go," she pleaded, trying to wrench her hand free, but her partner's grip was unyielding. The music grew louder, almost deafening, and the dance floor began to spin. The other dancers moved faster, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They were trapped, she realized, just as she was. No matter how hard she tried to stop, her feet continued to move, following the rhythm of the music. It was as if the floor itself was forcing her to dance. As she was spun around, Erica caught a glimpse of an old portrait hanging on the far wall. It was a painting of a nobleman, his expression stern, his eyes cold. The plaque beneath it read, "Lord Valtor, who cursed this ballroom to dance forever, in envy and spite." The realization hit her like a jolt of ice. This was no ordinary ballroom. It was a prison. Long ago, a jealous nobleman had cursed the place, trapping everyone who entered to dance for eternity, and now she was part of it. She had been envious, and that envy had brought her here, to this eternal masquerade. The man in the raven mask twirled her once more, leaning in close as he whispered in her ear, "Welcome to the eternal dance, my dear. You can't leave. No one ever leaves." Erica's vision blurred, her body moving of its own accord. The music was all she could hear, drowning out her thoughts, her voice. She was no longer dancing with her partner. She was just dancing, moving in endless circles, trapped in a rhythm that would never stop. Back to the old house. The scene shifts back to the pathway outside the old house. The fog begins to lift, and Erica's friends stand there, looking around anxiously. They wait, hoping to see her emerge, but as the fog clears, there is no sign of Erica. The pathway is empty, and the old house looms dark and silent behind them. No one ever saw Erica again. The final visitor, the boy who listened. The night was drawing to a close, and the street was quieter now. Most of the trick-or-treaters had returned home, their bags full, but a few still wandered, savouring the last of Halloween. Among them was a young boy, dressed as a little ghost, his eyes wide as he made his way down the street, glancing nervously at the old house. He had heard the stories about the place, the whispers that it was haunted, that strange things happened there, but he also saw the cauldron at the end of the path, filled with candy, and the sign that read, "Just take one, as greed is a sin." The boy hesitated, glancing back at the empty street. The house seemed to loom over him, its dark windows like hollow eyes, but the promise of candy was too tempting to ignore. He took a deep breath and slowly walked up to the cauldron, his small hand trembling as he reached inside. Carefully, he took just one piece, holding it tightly. He read the sign once more, then nodded to himself. "Only one," he whispered, and stepped back, turning to leave. As he made his way down the path, a thick fog began to roll in, swirling around him and the house, swallowing the old structure whole. The boy walked through the mist, his small figure disappearing for a moment. But then, from the other side, he emerged, still holding his candy, still in his little ghost costume, and completely unscathed. He looked back, but the fog was thick, and the house was hidden from view. Shrugging, he continued on his way, skipping down the street to the next house, ready for more treats. And with that, the fog around the old house remained, silent and still, hiding its secrets until the next Halloween night. Thank you for watching. Remember, all the stories you hear on this channel are completely original. Your support, from likes, comments, and super thanks to becoming a full member, is what keeps this channel alive and thriving. I couldn't do it without you, and I'm truly grateful for each and every one of you. Stay tuned for more chilling tales, and as always, thank you for being part of the Professor Shadow family.